Fire is an integral part of how Australian ecosystems function. For thousands of years, Aboriginal people have used fire to manage landscapes, and our plants and animals have evolved alongside these deliberate patterns of fire. In Northern Australia, this is now one of the best tools that we have to improve ecological health. And in the Kimberley, we've been using fire for 2 decades now. It's my pleasure to introduce my guest today, Dale Tucker, speaking to us from Broome. Dale is AWC's Regional Fire Manager in the Kimberley, and he's been working on the front line of AWC's conservation efforts since starting at Mornington in 2018. And he now coordinates our early dry season burning program across 4.3 million hectares. Dale, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Joey. Thank you for having me.
Dale, to start with, what's your background and how did you come to be working in the role of Regional Fire Manager in the Kimberley?
So, as briefly mentioned in the introduction there, I started in 2018 as a land management officer at Mornington. I spent a few years there and I did worked as a senior land management officer at Charnley before doing a little stint at Peruna and Carracamai, so two of the AWC sanctuaries just outside of Perth there. Came back to the Kimberley and then got a role working with the Euroka Rangers in Northeast Arnhem Land on their fire program. And then at the end of 2022, I came back to the Kimberley again and started working in the regional fire manager role. And throughout that time, since 2018, I've sort of gathered the skills and the experience needed to sort of be in the role that I'm in now throughout that time.
Just briefly, I'm fascinated by the time in Arnhem Land. Was that very different to the context in the Kimberley?
Very different. Obviously, the vegetation's very different. Up there, the culture is very different as well. A lot of traditional owners and mobs up there spent less time off country. There wasn't so much of a people being pulled off country through pastoral properties and missions and things like that. Whilst it did happen, not to the extent of the Kimberley, so very different in that regard. Um, and like I said, vegetation there very different. So northeast Arnhem Land, it's a lot of woodlands, Mignota woodlands, rather than big savannas that we get here in the Kimberley.
Hmm. So you've been drawn back to the Kimberley. What is it about that landscape that sort of keeps pulling you back to the northwest?
The Kimberley is a very special place. I mean, I think it's the vastness of the landscape that we operate across here. Like you said there, it's the program that we're looking after with the partnerships with Willigan and Dumby here is 4.3 million hectares. It's a huge, huge area. I think close to the size of Denmark as it stands at the moment. Um, and it's so varied. So, we're operating in the East Kimberley all the way through to the west, right along the Dumby coastline. And there's so much to see. It's ever changing, particularly because fire is very different year to year. The climate can be very, very different year to year. So it's constantly evolving and very, very interesting to work in the Kimberley.
Hmm. Of course, for conservation, it's a really important landscape as well, part of a sort of unbroken band of tropical savanna landscapes from
Mm.
Cape York all the way across to the west. And as far as we know, this is, the world's largest intact tropical savanna landscape,
Yep,
meaning that there's no, large scale intensive agriculture. There's cattle grazing, but there hasn't been a lot of clearing. The rivers are mostly unregulated. So, it looks broadly, structurally, what it might have looked like a few hundred years ago. Um,
absolutely, absolutely. It's important to mention there too, infrastructure wise and road networks are very few and far between as well. So it's not broken up in that regard either.
it's also a very fire-prone landscape. And for people who have travelled in Northern Australia or spent time up there, you'll know that it's a strongly monsoonal climate with big wet season and then many months of no rain at all. Does
Absolutely.
that sort of drive the fire patterns and the cycle through the year?
Absolutely. So we obviously get a big wet season at the end of the year, sort of starting December, and it can run all the way through to April, with most of the rainfall falling between December, let's say sort of end of February. So it drives all that vegetation growth, particularly grasses in the region. And then we have our dry season, our dry period, where it doesn't rain, blue skies, consistent prevailing easterly, southeasterly winds pretty much most of the time. So all that vegetation that has grown during the wet season subsequently dries out, a lot of it. And then as we start approaching back into the wet season, we have a build-up period where there's a lot of moisture in the air, but there's not enough for it to rain, and we get a lot of lightning that started a lot of natural fires in the Kimberley. So that's sort of the cycle that happens.
Yeah, and it's interesting that idea of a natural cycle of fire. I guess if you go back 100 years, the natural cycle of fire actually includes people in these
So it's
landscape fires. These were, populated landscapes and still are in a lot of places.
yeah.
But in the absence of traditional burning,
Yeah.
what does it look like when you get to that sort of September, October time of year? It hasn't rained for maybe 5 or 6 months. When a fire starts at that time of year and there's all that fuel on the ground, what does it do? How does it behave?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, like you said, so when people started getting removed off country up here, post-colonization, when pastoral properties and people started being sort of brought together into these pastoral properties or missions, a lot of that burning stopped happening that traditional owners and people have been doing. And that resulted in these large, mega late season wildfires. So without that early dry season burning that traditional owners would have been putting into the landscape, these large fires in the later part of the year. So from that build-up time where there's no rain and it's just lightning, swept across the landscape, burning hundreds of thousands, if not millions of hectares in one fire event.
Mm.
Sometimes, yeah.
And then that must have an impact not just on sort of the look of the landscape being scorched in these massive blazes at the end of the year, but also on wildlife, on infrastructure. What are some of the impacts of those burns that we know
It has
about?
a massive impact on biodiversity. So, there's numerous papers and research that AWC has conducted ourselves that it links sort of a patchwork mosaic burn, so what you would achieve in the early dry season, um, to the resource availability that the animals up here have available to them. So these large late season wildfires, they burn huge swathes of the country. Um, it means those smaller mammals, particularly, are vulnerable to that. At the moment, they're predated upon by cats. Cats have got a higher hunting success in those areas that have been recently burnt, particularly in the late dry season. And that's because they don't have those small mammals don't have somewhere to hide. They don't have those refuges available to them. But then also, as well as that, having that mosaic and that variety of different vegetation ages and that varied structure in the landscape allows different animals to thrive. So some do require recently burnt areas, some require long unburnt. So it's having a management tool that you can look after those species with, rather than
Mm.
just late season fires that you know uh, run through the landscape.
Yeah, you mentioned long unburnt vegetation, and I think it's really interesting depending on which part of Australia people are familiar with.
Mm.
I'm near Sydney in the southeast, and here we might think a 10-year or a 20 or 30-year interval would be long unburnt. But in the monsoon climate of the northwest, you're talking about 3+ years as long unburnt, just because fire is
Absolutely.
such a frequent phenomenon up there.
Absolutely, that's right. So we use 3+ as our metric for long unburnt, but that's not to say that some species like golden-backed tree rat need older than that, approaching 10-year-old. It's very difficult to achieve that, obviously, in some places, like in open savannas and in those grasslands, but in those refuge areas that do tend to stay wetter and greener, that are naturally protected by fire, you do sort of start to see around that 10-year mark. But generally, across the project area 3+ is long and burnt. Yeah.
Okay, and so to shift fire patterns in a way that we know is beneficial for biodiversity,
Mhm.
how do you sort of frame the objectives of what you're trying to do each season? What are you trying to, what's the end result of this dry season burning that you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, so with our, if you people are familiar with NAFI, Northern Australian Fire Information site, you can just look back at the early 2000s and see these large late season fires running through the landscape. The goal of AWC and our partners and the collaboration we have up here is to reduce the scope and extent of those late dry season fires, and increase the amount of long and burnt in key ecological areas. That's our scope. And the way that we're doing that, we produce burn plans every year for each of the project areas. So, for example, for Willigan, for Dumby, Mornington, Marion Downs, Tableland, all the project areas we have up here. And that basically outlines the goals and the way you would implement burning for that year. And that's taking into account vegetation type, topography, all the factors that need to be rolled in and looked at before any fire is put into the landscape.
Is it pretty much a relationship that the more burning you do in the early dry season, the less extensive the fire is in the late dry season? Is it that simple that we're sort of shifting the timing and
Potentially, it can be. It depends because it's such a large area. It does depend on where you are looking. So, some of the project areas in the higher rainfall bands, you can burn in the early dry season, and if there's rain in June, which with climate change, we're starting to see shifts in rainfall patterns. Does mean that it could potentially burn again in the late dry season. So these are all factors that we're taking into account when we're planning. We don't want to go down the route of just burning everything in the early dry season so we don't have any late season fires. It's not what we're trying to do at all. Late season fires are a natural part of the landscape. It's more the extent and the scope of those late season fires. So you can see the AWC sanctuaries there are in green. So in the bottom right-hand side of the screen there, you can see Mornington. So Mornington's been the longest one we've had in the Kimberley. Above that in green is Marion Downs, and then to the left of that in green as well is Charnley River Wildlife Sanctuary. And then you can see that north of that in the pink is the Willigan Partnership area, and that is huge just by itself. That covers about 1.8 or 1.7 million hectares. And then along the Kimberley coastline there in the pink again, you can see the Dumby Partnership area, and then just to the south of that, you can see the partnership area we have with the Department of Defence over Yampi Sound training area. So the way it has changed over time, it started with Mornington, or the fire program specifically, started with trials at Mornington in 2004, I believe it was. So looking at would early dry season fires have any impact, and would they, reduce the scope of late season wildfires? That was obviously very successful in 2007 with funding from the government. EcoFire was formed, and that included Mornington, Marion Downs, and the other partnership area, Tableland, which I think I missed there, with Yulimba Aboriginal Corporation. And it expanded over the subsequent years to include a lot of the pastoral properties along the Gibb River Road as well. So Ellenbray, Mount Elizabeth, Mount House, Drysdale. So huge area. And in 2017 through to 2022, that's when the partnerships came on board with the fire program as we know it, which included Dumby, Willigan, and Department of Defence and Yampi. And in 2023, so this is where there's a slight shift to what people know historically, we had discussions with Willigan about ecofire and the terminology around it. And there's a few reasons for that. Funding from the government stopped, I think it was in 2019 for the ecofire program. And AWC was solely funding that, and a huge amount of money, lots and lots of work. So we had initial discussions with Willigan about some of the pastoral properties, and they were going from just managing cattle to sort of shifting a little bit to carbon projects. So all those pastoral properties on the Gibb River Road pretty much fall under the Willigan Indigenous Protected Area. So they said, we'll start to deliver the early dry season burning and manage the carbon side for those pastoral properties, Ellen Bray and Gibb River. And then in 2024, we had further discussions with the other pastoral properties about early dry season burning and sort of handing back that early dry season burning to those guys. And that sort of came about naturally over those many years, starting from 2004 all the way to 2024. A lot of the property owners and stakeholders in the Kimberley, there was a lot more understanding why early dry season fire was put into the Kimberley. And now everybody does it themselves. Those pastoral properties are happy to put it in, especially to put fire in the landscape in the early season. It's a cool fire. It's not traveling too fast, particularly to protect their own pastoral requirements, I guess.
Yeah, it's great to see how that consensus has built. And I guess the culture around fire has sort of been reinvigorated and revived by some of these partnerships.
Good.
I heard someone explain it that, no one likes those big hot fires in the late dry season. They remove feed for cattle, they damage infrastructure, they can damage sacred sites as well for traditional owners. So there's really, they're damaging in so many different ways. And that's why we have been able to build an alliance around shifting the seasonality of fire and reducing the spread of those big, hot, late dry season burns.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think for some groups up here, some of the pastoralists that aren't necessarily looking at conservation values as much as we are, they still understand that spending generally in the scale of things a relatively small amount of money in the early dry season to mitigate the effects of late dry season fires is better than spending a lot of money trying to contain a late season fire when you don't have anything to work with, basically.
Yeah. So it's a massive logistical exercise, and we'll go into sort of some of the statistics of how far we fly and just the scale of it. But to start, could you explain what it's like when you're up there in the helicopter? What a day of this kind of aerial prescribed burning looks like?
We start burning generally on the back end of the wet season. So obviously, because it's such a big project area, we start in sort of the East Kimberley first, and it's sort of the drying, the curing of the vegetation shifts over to the west as the early dry season progresses. So we've normally started burning in some of the older areas of vegetation on Mornington, and particularly some areas of Tableland, sort of late February, early March, depending on the year. And what that entails for us is using those burn plans that we've developed in collaboration with the stakeholders and partners. We've got a good idea of where we want to go out and do the burning. So at the beginning of the day, we've got all the flight lines drawn up already. We will go out, we'll plan where we want to go burn in terms of how windy it is, how humid it is on that particular day. We'll load up the helicopter. So obviously most of the area we work, there's one road if we're lucky. The vast majority of it is inaccessible. So predominantly it's all helicopter based. We'll load up the helicopter. We have a rain dance machine that sits in the, oh, there you go, perfect. There's a picture there. A rain dance machine that sits in the back of the helicopter, and we're flying around in R44s, so Robinson 44s. You'll have your incendiaries in the helicopter with you as well, and they feed through that rain dance machine through the carousel. I think you can just make out there, and they'll fall out the side of the helicopter along those designated flight lines where we've chosen to fly for that day. So you'll have incendiary machine operator sitting in the back of the helicopter next to the rain nest machine, making sure that is fine, working okay, and swapping out those boxes of incendiaries as we need to. And then in the front, obviously, you'll have a pilot, very much important, and then a navigator sitting next to the pilot. And that navigator's role is to guide the pilot onto the flight lines that we want to fly and where we want to burn. And that person is also extremely important to making sure. So we plan a lot of these flight lines based on, maps and satellite imagery. It can look very different when you're actually out there flying over it. So that navigator is also making split-second decisions to whether they want to burn, on top of a range and let the fire creep down slowly, or whether we need to move the fire a bit further away from a riparian strip, making all those decisions. And so we do that every day. This year we did about, I think it was about 100 days, 90 days of flying around in a helicopter. And usually those days are somewhere between 5 to 6, 7 sometimes, particularly big days of flying around in a helicopter and lighting those fires through the landscape. There are the flight lines. So once that's done, we'll head back to base, take out the rain nest machine and clean it. All the data that we've collected from the day, so where we've flown, where we've dropped incendiaries, all gets taken off and collated, ready for reporting later on. And then we do it again and again and again.
It's enormous. The map I shared just before shows the cumulative flight lines. I think that was for 2024, perhaps.
That one was 2025, I think, that one
This
there.
year.
Yeah, so that's about 50,000 kilometers of flying around.
And
Yeah.
I worked out that's longer than a full lap of the equator. So the equator is about 40,000 kilometers. They've
There you
done,
go. Yeah.
another 25% on top of that.
Yeah.
Incredible. It's a huge, huge effort. And one of the most important levers we can pull in terms of improving the outlook for biodiversity across such a broad scale. There's also ground-based burning and different objectives with some of the ground-based burning. So protecting infrastructure is really important. And there are also bits where it's sort of fine scale habitat that we're interested in protecting. I'll share a couple of photos of some burning around the Marion Downs infrastructure. But how different is it delivering fire on the ground with a drip torch and those different tools?
Very different. It's obviously vital, not just for being able to protect infrastructure and some of those more susceptible to fire sites, but it also gives you a different perspective on it. You can lose a lot of the intricacies just by flying around in a helicopter all the time. And obviously, dropping incendiaries along a designated flight line can be very different to walking along a certain bit of vegetation with the drip torch as well. So it's really important for the teams to be involved with ground burning as much as possible to get that understanding of fire and to feel safe with fire. And the other key point to that is that not everybody wants to spend 5, 6, 7 hours in a helicopter all day, every day. So it's a great way to get, ranger groups involved, traditional owners, other stakeholders involved to all come together and deliver fire management as one sort of cohesive, collaborative unit.
I understand this year we also incorporated a fire walk with some of the Dambimangari rangers who we work with.
Yeah.
Tell us about that experience. It sounds really interesting.
Yeah, so it's the first one we've been able to do for a little while. So this year we had, I think it was about 8 people, including Braden Riles, who's the Yampi Dumby operations manager, out there with a group of Dumby rangers. And it was over 3 days in a remote part of Dumby country, with a campsite and people went out there with drip torches. And it's a really important tool. And I touched on it briefly before that not everybody wants to be spending that much time in a helicopter. So from a cultural perspective, it's about getting rangers and traditional owners together to share that knowledge, have fun whilst doing it. That sometimes can be lost a little bit, that people always should be out there on country to have fun and have a good time. Um, and also being able to have that chance to connect back with country. You know, that fire walk for some of those people that were on the trip, they hadn't done one before, you know, and the feedback from that, it was everyone had a really, really great time. So it's vitally important that we keep doing them. We've got another one planned next year, hopefully for a little bit longer period of time. Obviously, there are challenges there with access and choppers and making sure everyone's safe, but we will be planning on doing one next year. And then hopefully one for Willigan as well. And then potentially in future, a joint one over boundaries and things like that. Yeah.
Fantastic. So by this time of year, we're getting into the later part of the dry season, you've got a result across that entire program area with fire scars that have stitched together in a sort of patchwork mosaic. And if you can talk us through this year's result and the patterns that you've been able to establish in the landscape. The darker areas on this map are fire scars, right? And the
Yep.
areas are vegetation that hasn't burned this year.
That's correct. Yeah. So obviously you can see there's a pretty well-defined coverage over the entire project area of early dry season fire scars. And the way that stops a late season fire is that you can pick any sort of place in that project area, and there's a late season fire started there by lightning or whatever the cause may be, that it runs into those early dry season fire scars, doesn't have anything to burn, and subsequently sort of self-extinguishes or goes out, or the extent and scope of it is limited and slowed down so that you don't end up with sweeping fires that run all the way across a project area in one go. It's also important to note too, in those areas that were burnt in the picture we just saw before, so there's a few papers out, and some of the percentages do vary a little bit, but in the early dry season, about 17% is left unburnt in those early dry season fire scars, whereas it's about only 7% in late dry season fire scars. So whilst, you know, the coverage it might look like quite big, a lot of that area in those fire scars is left unburnt, protected, um, and provides habitat for those critical species we're trying to protect.
Yes, speaking of, we've done years of this kind of fire management with various iterations and different arrangements of area where we've been working. At the same time, we've had some kind of biodiversity monitoring and surveys across some of that area for 20 years. So starting at Mornington around 2004 as well. Are there any patterns that we can point to and say, yes, this kind of fire management has definitely benefited, this group of species or this sort of ecosystem, or is
It's
it more complex?
it's quite complex. It can be very difficult to pinpoint one thing or another. There are a lot of different variables coming into play. So it's very hard just to say this was a result of fire. We've got cattle management, cat impacts, cane toads, climate change, rainfall. So all those variables come into it. So it can be very, very difficult to say one way or another for a particular species. What we can look at, however, is research that was done at Mornington about the interaction between fire, cattle, and cats. And for those that aren't aware, I think there's a number that's thrown around. It's about 3 million native species just in the Kimberley alone get killed by cats every year here. So as an indirect tool to manage cats, providing, that patchwork mosaic, so small mammals particularly can hide and have somewhere they can retreat to, and you reduce the hunting success of cats. That is one major way we can have a difference, a conservation outcome for a wide variety of species. We're lucky to have had the Monash research team at Mornington since the later part of the 2000s, looking at a riparian strip along Annie Creek, just right next to Mornington there, looking at purple crown fairy wrens. and the impact of one of the outcomes of a fire that did get into that area. We were able to study what the impacts were. So that allows us to sort of tailor our approach when we're looking at other riparian areas across Mornington and the wider project areas. The outcome was that it was late dry season extremely bad for purple crown fairy wrens. Early dry season, whilst not ideal, wasn't anything compared to sort of a hotter, more intense fire.
It is so complex with all of those different factors. And yeah, our research is showing those interactions are key. So we know that big, hot, late dry season fires are a threat. We know that we've changed the patterns of those. And then for some species, there are encouraging signs. So it's not yet definitive, but things like the northern brown bandicoot, which, when we first started surveys at Mornington, had not been detected there. It sort of reappeared a few years into our regime of fire management, destocking, removing those feral herbivores. So it's sort of, pulling the levers that we can to improve ecological health. And then, ideally with the long-term eco-health monitoring that we do, we will get to a point where we can say, yes, this is the optimum sort of fire regime that really benefits.
Absolutely. Yeah, we are very fortunate to have sort of a 20-year data set particularly just for Mornington there. And it is something we're looking at to sort of answer some of those questions in the next year or two, collating all that data, having a look at, the trends and any interactions there. But yeah, we've done research in the past at Mornington about the impact of cats, and then other areas of northern Australia. There's a few more papers coming out. There's still lots of knowledge gaps there, but there are more papers coming out saying how critical long and burnt can be for some of these weight critical mammals, and sort of the interaction between fire frequency and how well they do in the landscape. Yeah.
I'm interested in how this project might evolve. We're 20 years into dealing with fire in this part of Northern Australia. What are the sort of technologies that could shift the way we deliver, the way we approach fire management in the Kimberley?
Yeah. So I briefly touched on satellite imagery. In the past, a coarser, sort of less, a lower resolution mapping product was available to us for mapping out these fire scars. And then a few more recent years, we've got something that allows us to look at fire scars in a higher resolution. Whilst it's not perfect, it gives us a better idea of where is actually burnt and where isn't burnt. And some of these changes, these all allow us to make the more information we have, the more refined and resolute our decisions can be. It takes out a lot of the guesswork, should I say. And then since 22, 23, we had that big wet season in the Kimberley. It was a bit of a wake-up call, particularly for me, being up here at the time, that we're going to start having to maybe adapt the program a little bit more, a little bit faster towards the impacts of climate change up here. So for those that aren't aware, 22, 23 was one of the highest recorded rainfall events in the Kimberley, and led to a lot of infrastructure damage at Mornington, with some of the houses and restaurant itself being fully underwater there. So those extreme climatic events, taking those into account and how we can adapt the fire program to that shift from huge wet seasons, which means lots and lots of vegetation growth, to hotter and hotter late dry seasons with higher temperatures through the day and more heat waves. So we're taking into account the satellite imagery. We're looking at vegetation index, moisture indexes for how wet and green vegetation is. We are investing more time into our early dry season burning. So we're putting in a little bit more fire in the early dry season compared to having to, in the past, we would have maybe been a little bit more responsive to going out and trying to deal with late season fires. So that's been a huge shift there.
And what I really want to ask about,
Yes.
because lots in the helicopter, 50,000 kilometers. Is there development of a sort of drone-based solution for lighting fires, and what's that up to?
Yeah, so we are getting there. We're quite lucky that one of our partners, so Willigan and Luke Russ, who is the Willigan fire manager, so he's my equivalent through Willigan, has sort of been spearheading the incendiary drone product with rain dance systems. So you can see it there. So that as a tool, that is another way we can put fire into the landscape at a different time. So we would still use helicopters, but the drone here would allow us to be able to burn at night over vast distances a lot more easy. And that means, the conditions are more benign at night. The temperature is, it's cooler. So it gives us another tool in our belt, basically, of putting in fire at the right time, particularly as we start to see, hotter on average days more and more frequently as we go.
I know you've been doing this work for a long time, Dale, but do you love it? Is it fun going out and lighting fires from the
It
air?
is really fun. And what the biggest thing for me is it's never the same. I know a lot of people say this about their job, it's very varied. But for me, every single year is very, very different. It's entirely dependent on rainfall, sort of who's involved, weather conditions, resource challenges, being able to get people to places. So constantly having to maybe think a little bit outside the box and sometimes be 2 steps ahead where I can be.
It's an enormous project, and we commend you for your work coordinating across such a large area and managing our fire program in the Kimberley. Thanks for speaking to us today, Dale.
Thank you, Joey. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you who have joined today to hear about this incredible program in Northern Australia. Don't forget you can read more about all of our work at australianwildlife.org. That's also where you can make a donation. So if you've been inspired by this work and you'd like to support this kind of on-ground frontline conservation, please head to australianwildlife.org. Thank you for being someone who cares about wildlife. Stay in touch, and we'll speak to you next time.